All right, we should be being recorded. I tell you what, I had to chuckle. I'm going to have to listen to the entire songs before I get it. I didn't think that first one was ever going to be finished. So anyway, uh, it's still a learning process, folks. Okay, um, we're going to go through Hosea chapter 8 today, and remember, this is the sixth Sabbath that we count, and so I got to tell y'all, finally, a chapter of Hosea that I can understand. I was so happy to see this chapter. It's some of it's still in poetic form, but it's fairly logical. And it's been a while since I've been able to do that. And I want to put the timeline up here that Mark gave us a long time ago, because don't forget now. Here's Hosea. He started with Jeroboam the second toward the end of his reign, and then he prophesied while I think three of them, four of them actually were murdered, the kings, and uh, he goes into captivity. Apparent, I mean, as Assyria is coming in and taking Israel into captivity, he goes south to Judah, and as I understand it, that's when he wrote the book. So we'll go through this, um, and I'm using the New King James Version today. I'm beginning to kind of get to where I like it. Um, so Hosea says, "Set the trumpet to your mouth. He shall become like an eagle against the house of Yahweh, because they've transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law." Now, I'm sure all of us understand that the trumpet was sounded at different times for different reasons. And maybe they would do three blasts and it meant one thing. If they did one blast, it meant something else, and so on. But the trumpet was blown to gather the people together for announcements. If you remember when they were at Mount Sinai, God spoke. Well, it was probably angels, but there was a trumpet blast that told the people, gather and come up close to the mountain. Don't touch the mountain, but come up close. The trumpet was blown to announce when they were moving the ark. It was blown when a king was anointed. It was blown to announce new moons, as particularly the new moon in the seventh month, the Feast of Trumpets. It was blown to begin the Jubilee year, which was on the Day of Atonement once every 50 years. And it was blown to announce war. And that's what Hosea is talking about here. Set the trumpet to your mouth. He shall come like an eagle. An eagle is a bird of prey, if you will, that's going to swoop down and catch a mouse running in the field, or catch a small varmint, or fish. And so Hosea is using eagle as a metaphor, I guess, but it's a metaphor I could understand. And it seems most likely that he's referring to Assyria. He shall come like an eagle. This is Assyria. Once again, Assyria is being used as a tool of God's wrath. Now, Hosea here was announcing that the end is near. We're reading this one chapter a week, but Hosea was preaching this whole thing. He was in the north. He was preaching to the people. He was preaching to the leaders. He was preaching to the king, or prophesying, if that's the way you want to look at it. Because of hundreds of years of God, of Israel's refusal to obey God. 250 years actually is
I've
250.
got some.
Yeah, Mark.
Sorry, I interrupt you. I apologize.
Oh no, go for it.
Earlier today, I was in a totally different section of the Bible and look up the word eagle. And I am reading. Well, I looked up the word eagle, and it means, or one of the central meaning of it is a vulture. So for this particular scripture, I'm reading out of the English Standard Version, and it says, "Set the trumpet to your lips." And as you've rightly pointed out, there are all kinds of signals. In this case, it's a signal of war, a warning of invasion. "One like a vulture is over the house of Yahweh, because they've transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law." You've alluded to that. You've not alluded. You said that very plainly. My point is that there's a different picture, because I'm thinking in other parts of the scripture it says, that God protects you, like, an eagle's wing hovers over you and that sort of thing. There's something that I haven't got my head totally wrapped out around, like, on this. But then there's another. So vulture, it has a different sort of connotation here in Hosea. And once again, I have a cross link in my Bible software that links it to Deuteronomy 28:49, which says, "The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the end of the earth, swooping down like an eagle, like the eagle or vulture, a nation whose language you don't understand." Doesn't that fit this scripture? How these things keep popping up, huh?
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
really like the thought of a vulture. Now I can see it going either way. If it's talking
Yeah.
about Assyria, they're going to swoop down, but a vulture is going to circle because there's dead people, on the ground. So I can see that really works. That's a good metaphor.
Well, an eagle, you think they attack their prey when they're alive. So there's shades of both of these things. We think of a vulture eating carrion. So there's a meaning both ways, isn't there?
Yeah, I really like the vulture part because it makes sense that the vulture would be circling around, and then also the eagle, like you said, it's a little bit of both. That's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, I was about to say Mark's always one step ahead of me. I'm grateful for that because the difference between an eagle catches live prey and healthy prey at that because they're so fast. But a vulture also swoops, but it feasts on the dead. And Israel at this point was already spiritually dead. And they're scavengers, and they basically pick everything right to the bone. So there's nothing left. Where an eagle's not like that, but a vulture is, and they hunt in packs. The vultures do, as opposed to eagles are solitary hunters, generally speaking. But vultures are not. They'll come in flocks. Just something else that's an interesting difference between an eagle and a vulture. So
Either way, you're going to be devoured.
Uh-oh. Okay, who said that?
it sounded like John, but wow, what an echo!
Yeah, I thought it was John.
Yeah, I said either way, you're going to be devoured.
Yeah, yeah. It reminded me of something. Hang on just a second. Maybe I'll think of it in a minute. This old 74-year-old brain is not working like it used to. Okay, so Hosea is announcing to the northern tribes that the end is near. because of hundreds of years of their refusal to obey God. I mean, they thumbed their noses at God. All of the stuff that they have done since Jeroboam the first set up the two calves, which we'll talk about a little bit later, has been an affront to God. Oh, I know what it was: patience. Three vultures sitting on a limb, and one of them says to the other two, "Look, I'm tired of being patient. I want to kill something." So anyway, sorry. Uh, so these people had rebelled almost from the beginning when Jeroboam set up the two calves, one in Bethel, which is in the south, one in Dan, which was in the north, so that they would have a place to worship instead of going to Jerusalem. Now, on the surface, Jeroboam, I think he slipped one in on these people initially, and they bought into it. But I don't think that Jeroboam said, "Hey, we're going to set up a bunch of idols up here. We're going to set one in Bethel and one in Dan, and you can come in and worship Baal." I just don't think that's the way it happened. It's the old frog in the water thing, which I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, you all, I'm sure, get the point. But as it turned out, these people weren't going to Dan and Bethel to worship the one true God. Maybe initially they were, but it probably didn't last long, because one of the first things that Jeroboam did, as we all know, was to begin to change the Moeds. The first one he changed, and maybe the only one, but the first one he changed was the Feast of Tabernacles. But we know they ultimately began to worship Baal or Baal. All right, verse 2. Israel will cry to me, "My God, we know you." Now, I don't know if Hosea is being sarcastic here, because we know that Israel didn't know God. How could there be a more insincere cry than this? "My God, we know you." Now, this is after 250 years of disobeying God, of worshiping Baal and Astaroth and whatever other gods that they were worshiping. They didn't know God. And this was a cry of desperation, apparently. That's what I'm thinking, because they knew, the eagle and the vultures were on their way. And Hosea said in chapter 7 that the Israelites actually thought God was not watching or didn't remember their disobedience. And I think we all know better than that. And I'd maybe put a couple of dollars on it that they knew it too. But they just kept on keeping on. And their idolatry. Yeah, Michael.
Well, I was going to say, with the scripture, ties into something that Paul wrote in the New Testament and Jesus talked about. And that was, Israel had the form of religion, but they denied the actual power of it. And this is very similar to what Jesus warns the church, where they're going to say, "Hey, didn't we cast out demons in your name? Didn't we prophesy in your name?" And what does Jesus tell them? "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew you." I think that ties into what Hosea is talking about here. I think that the parallel is interesting.
Yeah, you're right, and it's going to fit in even better in a few scriptures. I've actually got that, because it really hits not only here, but it hits this other scripture we'll get to later on. Israel's idolatry was pervasive. The whole nation had abandoned the one true God. Now, we read, let me say it again, we read sometimes that it seems that some of the people were worshiping the one true God, but if they were, it wasn't very many of them. But the whole nation had abandoned the one true God for the worship of false gods. They'd been steeped in idolatry for about 250 years. And here at the last minute, they thought they could have a deathbed confession. My God, we know you. No, they didn't. And they could be saved. The old deathbed confession thing. So as we've been studying these northern tribes, we would occasionally see the Israelites making a pretense of devotion to Yahweh, but it was just a pretense, and we'll cover that more as we go forward. They would sometimes acknowledge him as their God, but it was lip service. And sometimes we in the church have given lip service to God. We would say, well, such and such and such and such, but we didn't mean it, or we didn't carry through, or whatever. But Israel's sins spoke louder than her words did. My God, we know you, did not speak as loud as her actions. The words of this verse, Israel will cry to me, is very similar, Michael, to what Jesus Christ say that he will say to some that are rejected on the day of judgment. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare, I never knew you. I mean, you hit it right on the nail. It applies to more than one of Hosea's comments. Verse 3, Israel has rejected the good. Yeah, I think we've got that one 2020. The enemy will pursue him. Get ready. There's a vulture up there circling, and there's an eagle about to dive down. The people had rejected the good. And the good of knowing and serving God. They had totally rejected. It was a lot more fun to worship Baal and go to the temple and have sex with a temple prostitute or whatever, because for over 250 years, Israel had cast the one true God aside. Sort of like we're seeing today. And they had turned aside to worship the fun gods, little g's, of the nations around them. And I'm going to read something from Deuteronomy, which, by the way, has verse 49, which you all just mentioned. And as it says in Deuteronomy, the enemy, that is the Assyrian, will pursue him. Speaking of pursuing Israel. This is according to the curse announced against them in the law if they would forsake Yahweh and break his covenant. And here it is. And this is where verse 49 down there that you mentioned a minute ago. It says, moreover, all these curses are going to come on you and pursue you and overtake you. You can't outrun them until you're destroyed, because you didn't obey the voice of Yahweh your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded you, and they'll be on you for a sign and a wonder, and on your descendants forever, if you will keep them. But because you didn't, verse 47, you didn't serve Yahweh your Elohim with joy and gladness of heart for the abundance of everything. This is what you could have had. So you're going to serve your enemies, that Yahweh will send against you. And you're going to have starvation. You're not going to have the water you need, and nakedness, in need of everything. And he'll put a yoke of iron on your neck until he destroys you. Yahweh will bring a nation against you from afar. I can't help but think of Assyria here, but Syria and Egypt and other nations also came on them. And, we kind of think of Assyria deciding on Nissan 5, they're going to go down and take the whole. No, this took place over a long period of time. They would come down and take a piece. They take a city, and ultimately, when Assyria came at the end, a lot of Israel was already gone. And then in verse 49, Yahweh will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies. That's, Mark, I think, mentioned that. Or the vulture, a nation whose language you will not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which does not respect the elderly, nor show favor to the young. This nation of fierce countenance didn't care that there were old people that could barely get around. They were going to be the ones that got killed first. They were the easy ones. They didn't have to fight them. Israel had been steeped in idolatry for almost 250 years, as I've said a couple of times. And here at the last minute, I'm sorry, I backed up. Let me catch up. The words of this verse Okay, I went backwards. Sorry, folks. I think everybody knows I go by my notes. I can't, I can't speak about anything unless I've got notes in front of me. But let's back up. And yeah, Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him. And then this verse and verse 4. You catch up here for just real quickly. Okay, verse 4. They set up kings, but not by me. So this is what I'm talking about. I can actually understand this. This is not so poetic that I'm going, what in the world is Hosea talking about? They set up kings, but not by me. They made princes, but I didn't acknowledge them. From their silver and gold, they made idols for themselves that they might be cut off. The people of Israel had chosen their leaders. They'd chosen their kings without seeking any guidance from God. As a result, there was no continuing dynasty in the north. The south had a dynasty that is still in effect today. And God's going to have David sitting on the throne. He's going to have Jesus Christ, who is a descendant of David, sitting on the throne. But the north didn't have that. Jeroboam, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say Jeroboam could probably have had that dynasty if he hadn't set up the 2 golden calves and hadn't changed the date of the feast and probably some of the other holy days and things. There were 9 different dynasties in the north that came into power. Not one like the Davidic dynasty in Judah. And they never consulted God. And so 18 kings reigned over the north out of 10 different families. And no family came to a close except by violent death. And you can look at I'm not going to go back and get it, but it shows that in the timeline that Mark gave us. Furthermore, the people, as he says in verse 4, made idols of gold and silver, which was probably a reference to the golden calves at Bethel and Dan, the extreme north and the extreme south of Israel. And verse 5, your calf is rejected, O Samaria. My anger is aroused against them. How long till they attain to innocence? Okay. Your calf is rejected, O Samaria. Now, I took a lot of this stuff from commentaries. I think you all know that I use a lot of commentaries, but your calf is rejected. Well, what calf is he talking about? Well, there's one in the north, one in the south, but he mentions Samaria, and as far as we know, there wasn't a calf in Samaria, but Samaria is it's representative of the whole country. It's the capital of Israel, and Israel had rejected God. So in turn, Hosea says the calf which Israel had chosen to be their God instead of Yahweh has rejected him. So it is with all idols. All idols fail. Mark did a great job talking about the hidden realm. I think that's the name of it. Anyway, Hosea mentions the calf because it was the symbol of Israel's idolatrous ways. And Samaria, not because of a golden calf, but it was Israel's capital city and represented the kingdom. So Hosea now, in verse 5, condemns the golden calves that were placed in these shrines as a source of false worship. And they represented the combination of Baal and Yahweh that was worshiped. Now, this was initially. I think as time went on, there was less Yahweh than Baal, and the worship of these calves and the temples and things became purely Baal worship. By Hosea's time, only the calf in Bethel remained. That's the one in the south, because the king of Assyria, or I'm sorry, I think in this case it was the king of Syria, had conquered Dan, which is where that calf was, in 733 BC, and presumably had destroyed the shrine there. So, verse 6, for from Israel is even this, a workman made it. He's speaking of the calves. He's speaking of the false man-made idols. A workman made it, and it's not from God. But the calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces. Again, Samaria, being the capital, represents the whole country. The calf of Samaria, the calf of Israel, shall be broken in pieces. And the main reason why the calves were a stench before God was that they were man-made. They were idols. And he made it very clear in the Ten Commandments that they and us were not to worship or let's see, how is it that some of these churches that have idols in their church, well, we're not really worshiping the idol, we're worshiping God. The idol just represents God. And this is maybe what they were saying. They were man-made idols. So God was going to see that they were demolished, broken in pieces. And the calf idol was a product of human craftsman skill. How then could it be considered a god? The words, it is not God, were probably meant to refute Jeroboam at the end of, in the middle of verse 6, that second sentence. A workman made it, and it's not God. It's probably meant to refute Jeroboam, who said this, Therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, it's too far for you to go to Jerusalem. I've set up these 2 golden calves for you. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. Does that sound familiar? It should. And Aaron received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a golden molded calf. Then they said, and I used to think this was Aaron who said it, but it's they, whoever they are. Then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." These guys had just left a country that God had totally destroyed, and that on the night of the Passover, which comes from Yahweh passing over the firstborn that had the blood over the door, and they had seen miracle after miracle after miracle, and yet they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." Insane. Okay, verse 7. They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no bud. It shall never produce meal. If it should produce, aliens would swallow it up. The wind, now here's it gets a little metaphorical here. The wind speaks of the emptiness of Israel's sin. They sow the wind. They sow these worthless. They act like they're obeying God, but they're not. The whirlwind speaks of God's impending destruction. Think of a hurricane. Think of a tornado. They sow the wind, 20-mile-an-hour winds, and reap the whirlwind, a Cat 5 tornado. And so that punishment that Hosea is talking about here had already begun. The stalks were not producing grain. If you look at it literally, and we can look at it both metaphorically and literally. If we look at it literally, the stalks were not producing grain that could be milled into flour. If we look at it literally, God had apparently withheld the rain. Furthermore, if any stalks did produce grain, it was only for foreigners to snatch it up. Thus, Israel, like the grain, was being swallowed up. She was losing her national identity and her independence because she had depended so much on Syria, Assyria, Egypt, and other nations that were around. I mean, they made deals with everybody. So she was despised by these people. Yeah, they're supposed to be protected by their God, but guess what? We're going to go in there and we're going to take them over. We're going to take their food. We're going to take their children. We're going to do all of this stuff. And so she lost all respect of the nations around her. She was despised like worthless pottery. Now, in an earlier chapter, Hosea speaks of Israel's attitude that God is not watching. God doesn't know what we're doing. He didn't have any idea what we're doing. And they got by with their idolatry for a while, but only because God is very patient. Eventually, their evil deeds will catch them. This is what Hosea is telling them. And it reminds me of a story I've probably told you all before of the guy that's on the top of the Empire State Building and he jumps off. and he falls about 40 floors, and some guy hollers out the window, hey, you having a problem? You need any help? And the guy said, nah, nothing's happened to me yet. Sorry, it reminded me of that. Okay, verse 8. Israel is swallowed up. Now they are among the Gentiles, like a vessel in which is no pleasure. So Hosea is bouncing back and forth between they're about to be taken captive and they're already taken captive. I mean, he knows what's going to happen, and he kind of talks about it that way. So over time, Israel's foreign policy of involving herself with other nations that God warned them not to mix with, when you come into the land which Yahweh, your Elohim, is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. And they didn't listen. They intermarried. They brought in their gods. Here we are. Israel's involvement with foreign nations against God's warnings was swiftly robbing the nation of its strength and its identity as God's people. And not only will all they have be swallowed up by the enemy, but they themselves also will be swallowed up by the enemy. And this is not in the future. This is now for them. Verse 9. For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey alone by itself. Ephraim has hired lovers. So Hosea compares Israel's asking for aid from Assyria and Egypt and Syria to the wandering of a wild donkey. And donkeys, back then, they may be now, but back then they were well known for the donkey's desire to be totally independent. Leave me alone. I'll go where I want to go. I'll eat what I want to eat. I'll sleep where I want to sleep. This was a donkey, and this is the metaphor here. Israel was stubborn. Now, I realize a donkey's not a mule, but there's a little bit of that in there. A mule is the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. And that's where a mule comes from, which doesn't have anything to do with this. I read that this morning. I thought it was interesting. A donkey was well known for its desire to be totally independent, and Israel was stubborn in going her own way and foregoing God's guidance. Why do we need to listen to God? We're a big, strong nation. We've done all of this stuff, and they got to where they thought they were doing it themselves. And like Hosea said earlier, they forget that God's watching. This comparison shows Israel's free-spirited attitude. The comparison with the wild donkey. It shows Israel's free-spirited attitude and Israel's desire to live unrestrained by God's standards. We don't need to listen to God. We can do whatever we want to do. We're big, strong. We are a great nation. We don't need God anymore. And Israel's alliances were also compared to prostitution. Ephraim has hired lovers. And Ephraim is also used to mean the whole nation in the north. And like a prostitute, Israel had sold herself to lovers, foreign powers. And Israel had forgotten God, and they had forgotten that God was the one that was protecting them. And they had gone to Assyria for help. That angered God when Israel did that. So Israel abandoned her trust in God and adopted idols. And God backed off. I'm not going to have anything to do with those people. They don't want my help. They're not going to get it. Verse 10. He goes on and he says, yeah, though they've hired among the nations, I'm going to gather them, and they'll be sorrowful a little because of the burden of the king of princes. It's maybe talking about the king of Assyria, could be talking about the king of Syria, but most likely it's talking about the king of Assyria. So despite Israel's desperate attempts to preserve herself, God's judgment was certain. It's going to happen. Hosea is there saying, hey. Joel was there saying, hey. But they wouldn't listen. Yahweh is pictured as bringing her back from her wanderings to Assyria and Egypt so that he might oppress her. Now, God doesn't oppress just for the fun of it. He doesn't oppress people to make himself feel good. He oppresses people so they will learn from the mistakes that they've made. The instrument of judgment would be the mighty king, the king of Assyria, from whom, ironically, they had sought aid. You know, it's funny. Israel sought aid from the king that's going to come and capture them or be the final source of their captivity. And Israel sent presents to the king of Assyria to bribe the king of Assyria to protect themselves. And this was also against the will of God. Now, God would gather the nations not for the help of Israel, but for its destruction. But that was only the beginning. They would be gradually reduced and brought low through skirmishes by the Assyrians, by the Syrians, by the Egyptians, and so on, until the end when they were weak. They didn't have an army, or it wasn't worth much, and they were carried away. Hosea anticipates here the full force of the Assyrian captivity on Israel. Although the people had looked to the nations for help, God would gather them together in order to inflict this punishment on his people, to teach them. And as a result, their numbers began to diminish under the oppression of the mighty king, which was most likely the king of Assyria. And although God sometimes promises to gather his people for deliverance, and we've seen those scriptures throughout the Bible, that's his ultimate plan. Here, Yahweh would gather them for judgment. This courting of foreign powers, which is what Israel had done for years, would be of no avail. They're not going to come help. Very soon, the people would be gathered for judgment by God and taken into a strange land. And they think that joining Assyria is the way to prevent their calamities. You know, Assyria was the big dog on the block. They were they could conquer anybody. But it's going to appear that this was a ready way to bring the calamities on Israel that God wanted. And they've hired the aid of the nations to secure them against their God and his judgments. And God says, I will, says God, assemble and herd them together. I will gather them. that they may be taken and destroyed together. Others say that God will gather the nations together against Israel, and Israel will be sorrowful for a while until their final captivity. And they'll complain and they'll be grieved. And, it talks about for the burden of the king of princes, the tribute laid on them by the king and the princes is ultimately going to destroy them. Verse 11. Because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, they have become for him altars for sinning. An altar is made, if it's made by God's people, to sacrifice and send a pleasing odor up to God's nostrils, metaphorically. And the altars are there to worship him. And we all remember the story of Elijah and the excuse me, the prophets of Baal. So God sometimes promises to gather his people for deliverance, but here he's gathering them for judgment. And this courting of foreign princes will be of no avail. Now, going on in verse 11, because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, not altars made to worship Yahweh. Hosea was showing the Israelites the grave error that they made in going to pagan nations. God told them right up front, I'm with you. I'm your God. I will protect you. And Israel said, no, you won't, because we don't need you. And this is why all of this bad stuff came on Israel. They went to these nations that God had told them to avoid. We'll go as far as to say that God told them to wipe out some of these nations, but they didn't. They intermarried. They started worshiping their other gods and so on. And so now he shows them how far they've moved. This is Hosea. Hosea has shown them how far they've moved from the worship of the true God, of the one true God. The people had built many altars for sin offerings, but these altars had become altars for sinning. They didn't worship Yahweh. They worshiped Baal and they worshiped Ashtaroth. And one other thing that they did, they mixed the worship of God with the worship of Baal, and the sacrifices that they made were an offense to God because they didn't wholeheartedly devote themselves to his commandments. God had appointed one altar, and it was at Jerusalem. And there he wanted the sacrifices to be offered, which he would accept. To multiply altars was to multiply sin. Now, God had ordained, the temple in Jerusalem as his central sanctuary for the people to come and worship. And this is why Jeroboam put the two golden calves, one in the north, one in the south, so the people wouldn't go back to Jerusalem. But then when the kingdom divided, Jeroboam set up these false altars at Bethel and Dan. And Hosea made it very clear that these were in no way a religious help to Israel. They had become altars for sinning. Verse 11. but that God considered them only as altars for committing sin. He didn't, he didn't look at them as altars to come and worship him. Verse 12. I have written for him the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing. Now I'm going to interrupt myself and leave my notes, which is rare. But how many of us over the years have been told that what we believe is crazy? What we believe, that's Jewish stuff. We don't have to do it anymore. All that stuff is nailed to the cross. What in the world is wrong with you people? Hadn't everybody run into some of that? I know I have run into a lot of it. And my response was not good. I called people stupid and idiots and can't you read? And I know Michael has that in common with me. But in verse 12, God says, I have written for him, Israel, the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing. Ignorance was no excuse for their disobedience. God wrote his 10 commandments with his own hand twice. And he wrote through his servant Moses many laws for them to obey. Laws that were meant for their betterment, laws that were good for them, laws that would help them to become a great nation. And the Israelites were to remember these laws. They were to teach their children these laws. And ultimately, they were supposed to go out and teach them to the entire world. But Israel didn't do that. Israel said no. They thought the law as something alien or strange. So the fault lay with the people, not with God, and certainly not with his law. Verse 13. For the sacrifices of my offerings, they sacrifice flesh and eat it. But Yahweh does not accept them. Now he will remember their iniquity, and he will punish their sins, and they shall return to Egypt. Now that's a strange thing for Hosea to say about returning to Egypt, because he specifically told them, you're not going back to Egypt. As they rejected God's law, so God rejected their sacrifices. And those weren't offered according to his law. It wasn't even done by Levites and descendants of Aaron. Instead, now, while they were offering the sacrifices, God would show indeed that he remembered the sins for which the sacrifices were intended to atone. They didn't atone for their sins. God remembered them. And God commanded them not to return to Egypt. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For Yahweh has said to you, you shall not return that way again. But God had threatened them that on their disobedience, he would bring them back to Egypt. Now, Egypt is a type of sin. It's a type of their captivity. They weren't free when they were in Egypt. Think of all the things that were bad about Egypt. Hosea also foretells that many of them would go to Egypt and would perish there. So some of them were literally going to Egypt. And Egypt was a type of slavery. Deuteronomy 28:68. And Yahweh will take you back to Egypt, in ships, by the way of which I said to you, you will never see Egypt again, but there you will be offered for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. You know, at least, I suppose, at least a slave would receive food and shelter and clothing. But that's not what God's talking about here. He says, you're not going to like it. Now, thinking of the altars that I mentioned a minute ago, or mentioned several times today, I guess, Hosea says that God charged the people who were using these false altars that they had made on their own, and they had used them to offer sacrifices that belonged to God, which should have been offered in the proper place and manner. Now, the law permitted certain parts of various sacrificial animals to be eaten. You know, we can go back and read, some of that, particularly by the Levites. But the Israelites were eating whatever they wanted. Oh, hey, look at that filet. Let's cut that thing out. I'm going to take that home to Mama. They were eating the parts that they wanted, which compounded their sin. And the animals that they brought to an altar was just meat in God's eyes. It wasn't a sacrifice. It wasn't a way to worship God. It was simply meat. And it had no sacrificial value. And their reward for these kind of sins? Captivity in Assyria. Now, furthermore, though God permitted certain parts of various sacrificial animals to be eaten, these people were eating whatever they desired. Did I just read that? Nah, I think maybe I did. Well, anyway, let me go on. Verse 14, last verse. For Israel has forgotten his maker. Boy, think about that line right there. Does that apply down through the ages? Does it apply today with, the messes that we've found ourselves in? Israel has forgotten his maker. Israel has built temples. And then he brings Judah in. He says Judah also has multiplied fortified cities. We're safe. We have a big tall wall between us and the enemy. We're safe. We don't need God. But God says, I'm going to send fire on his cities, and I'm going to burn down his palaces. And we read in Deuteronomy 28:52, they will besiege you at all your gates until your high and fortified walls, in which you trust, the walls you depend on, the walls that you don't need me anymore, till those walls come down throughout all your land. Ask the people at Jericho. Well, I guess you can only ask Rahab. She's the only one that survived, I think. And they shall besiege you at all your gates throughout all your land, which Yahweh, your Elohim, has given you. God's judgment came through the Assyrians, and one of their kings, Sennacherib, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So this is going on all the while that Israel is being attacked and taken captive. But God held off a little bit in Judah. He wasn't ready for them to be taken into captivity yet. God was Israel's maker, going back to this. Israel has forgotten his maker. And not only as the creator of all things, but as the author of Israel's existence as a people. God, through people who obeyed him, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on, he created a people. Well, the people were already created, but he created the mindset of a people that would obey him. And the sin that's charged against Ephraim is idolatry. And the one that is charged against Judah is self-confidence. They were fine. They had fortified cities. And they were busy building fortifications, hoping to protect themselves from enemies. They didn't need those walls. They needed God. But both nations had forgotten God. Both had offended him. And in the doom of others, each sinner may read his own. Apparently, I got that out of a commentary because I don't know what that means. Of the cities of Judah, Isaiah says, your country is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. An additional ground of Israel's punishment is that the people had forgotten their God and had instead put their confidence in fine palaces, and Judah too had come to rely on fortified cities. And God was about to burn up their fine palaces and their fortified cities. That's chapter 8. Thoughts, comments, corrections? I kind of liked it because I could halfway understand what Hosea was saying.
Skip.
Yeah, well,
yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, Syria was the big man on the block. They actually were large enough to capture Israel, but Egypt is mentioned along with Syria. But I don't think Egypt was so big. What God is talking about, I believe, is like you were mentioning, is that Israel been wanting to go back to Egypt kind of all along from the very beginning. They made those golden calf, and they said, well, this is the God that took us out of Egypt. And they still observed the golden calf. So they got kind of what they wanted from the beginning. They spiritually went back to Egypt.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's
And many times in their trek or journey, they'd say, let's go back to Egypt. Yeah, we were slaves, but at least they fed us. And but yeah, you're right. I think spiritually they had gone back to Egypt, and I hadn't really thought about that. Good point.
I think it's talking metaphorically about bondage. They were already in bondage, be a tradition to the gods of the other Elohim of Egypt, and so in reference to the unseen realm, that they wanted to go right back into the bondage of the ways of the nations around them. For me, this chapter is again, I want to put it in modern context because I think when it's talking about, for example, the scripture, it says, "Sow the wind, reap the whirlwind." If you look at that verse in context with the entire chapter here, what it's talking about is false religion. You're talking about a people that had forsaken the one that brought them out of bondage, the one that had blessed them with liberty and gave them his laws and his commandments, which were going to give them a sense of liberty and freedom in the ability to be prosperous under his laws and his ways, which are right and good. And they forsake all of that for other religions. And it began with a counterfeit, obviously, when Jeroboam put the calf again, introducing the religious ideology coming out of Egypt of the calf, put them in Dan and Bethel. And then I think over time that became tradition to where they were worshiping a counterfeit of Yahweh Elohim, which is not him. They combined the worship of probably Yahweh with the traditions of the nations around them. And of course, as time went on over the centuries, it became more overt and direct until you get to the point where they're building altars to the different Baals and the Astaroths and all that. And today we have our own version of that. You have a nation that was forged on liberty, was forged on the basis of God's laws and his commandments based on scripture. And we have created a whole different set of religious beliefs and practices and have created altars which are counterfeits. And I mean, I suppose from the old way of thinking, it was always referenced to Protestant, churchianity as the false altars. And that may be to a degree, but in a national sense, now we've created altars. We're worshiping Baals. We're worshiping, literal Baals. We're worshiping what's that one statue in Arkansas? I forget what it's not Imhotep, but Bomofet or whatever.
Yeah, the
But
symbol
you've
for
got
Satan. Yeah.
but now you've got altars that have been set up over just the last 15 years. You have altars to homosexuality, you have altars to transgenderism, altars to radical environmental Nazism, for lack of a better word. You have all these different altars, which are actually they're all sowing the wind, and they're going to reap the whirlwind, because the harvest that's going to come from that is, we're worshiping the earth. So everyone has to worship at this altar. So you can't use electricity, you can't use gasoline, you can't, you have to deny your gods in order to worship our gods, and that's how this goes. And so the people then lose the liberty that God had wanted them to have, because they were all busy getting wrapped up in all these other false altars that are out there. And so they literally have sold themselves into misery and slavery. And from a political sense, just look at how Marxism and communism works. Everything regresses back into where everyone is miserable except the elites that run the show. And you have a caste system that is then imposed. And then, of course, that's Satan's way. And I saw that in India when I was over there, and that's what he's doing here. And so it all ties together in terms of this forsaking God, forsaking the keeping his commandments, but also honoring and worshiping him, and trading those for false gods that are initially grafted into the worship of Yahweh Elohim. We're going to pay him lip service, but then over time, that becomes tradition, and then we go right into literally worshiping the false Elohim of the other nations around them, to where we're worshiping Baals, we're worshiping Baphomet here in the United States. And so the people then go back into bondage. They go back into slavery. And the one scripture you read there is that they think that they're better off selling themselves into slavery, because at least, like you said, they'll have shelter and food, because they're starving. But then no one's going to even buy them. So they're left destitute and desolate, because the vultures that God sends to devour them and their land, they'll consume everything and nothing will be left. And so even trying to sell themselves into slavery isn't going to work for them, because they're going to be utterly annihilated and the flesh picked from their bones. And I think that's where we're going as a country. So good study, Skip. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't know if Hosea would be telling us it's as close as he told them, but who knows? I mean, this thing's a mess. I mean, it's just a mess. All right. I actually enjoyed, understanding several of those scriptures. I'm just not a poet person. I think you all know that. So, but yeah, thanks, Michael.
So
Yeah,
following on from some of the stuff that you guys have been talking about, I recently came across some information about the number of people who believe in the United States, and maybe Michael mentioned this a while back, but the number of people who, since we live in the U.S., the number of people who profess belief in God has plummeted over the last 10 years. The survey is what it is, and we can all argue with the quality of the survey or question what a person's real beliefs are. But the point is that there are people, multitudes of people in this country who are not professing meaningful instruction from the Bible, as well as belief that God has relevance and authenticity in our society. And this ties right back into what Michael was talking about these altars that secularism is bowing down to. And we shouldn't not believe that let me restate that. All these things that we see going on are cultish, are religious. They have religious beliefs involved in them. They are a religion to these folks. They may not think of it in the same way that we might think about it, but it is. It's a cultish following. It's a religious following that's going on around us.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It's not a following of Christ or of God, but it is a cult of beliefs, and it's a religion. I agree 100%. Can you see? Go ahead.
Well, we could even talk about that. One of the big tenets about cults is that there is a powerful leader who tells people how they have to believe, and they can't speak up against, and people can't speak up against it. Now, in a lot of times in religious circles, that's pointed at an individual person. And now it's an individual movement. So you can't, and they have captivated national media and national police states. You can't speak against certain beliefs, otherwise you are, quote, canceled.
Yep.
You're cast out, etc. It's a whole movement that's the focus, not an individual person.
Yeah, you're talking about a religious fanaticism, which comes from false altars to these other Elohim, these false gods, the gods of the land. I just for example, I don't have the poll in front of me. I read it yesterday. They were describing this whole transgender movement. The number just in the last 4 years, the numbers of elementary school kids now that identify as transgender has jumped from like 3% to 60% in some areas. Like 60% of the kids are expressing, a transgender. They want to switch their biology, and of course that's by the preaching of the gospel of transgenderism. And you cannot, as Mark said, you can't speak against it. So and it's another form of slavery that we're, this bondage, this whirlwind that we're all going to reap as a result of all of this. So yeah, the insidious religious nature of these other gods that the people are worshiping, these altars for sinning that Skip mentioned, that's what they're there for. Now it's starting to morph into pedophilia. It's not just transgenderism. Now the child grooming, and now the new religious movement is sex with children and the grooming of children to become sex objects in public schools, in governmental institutions. And I read an interesting article yesterday, mainly because the elite are bored, because they can do whatever they want, and so they need the next crazy, off the wall abomination and affront to God, and that's, well, we're gonna molest infants now. We're going to sexually molest, toddlers and preschoolers, and it's sick, but that's what Satan is. That's what he does, and so it's an unfortunate situation. And I don't think I imagine it if we could see, we're reading about ancient Israel, but if we could see the similarities between what we have going on in this country right now with what was going on with the temples and the temple prostitutes and all the other garbage, we'd be shocked at the similarities between the northern tribes and this country right now. And if we understand the judgment that God enters into with the northern tribes, we should be quaking in our boots. Or to quote Thomas Jefferson, I reflect that God is just and that his justice will not be withheld forever.
Yeah, I forgot the company. I was just telling Diane the other day that I read an article that an employee of that company, and Diane, you may remember who it was. If you don't use the pronouns that they want you to use, you can be fired. Now, I know there's more than one company that does that, but I'm sorry, I'm not using the pronouns. I'm gonna, Barb, you're a she. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, you have the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security issued a memo that, along with the FBI, that people that refuse to call people by their proper pronouns are domestic terrorists. And it's, these are official government documents. And of course, that's where all of this is being directed out to the country, to the National Education Association, to big industry, or, it all ties together. I mean, we are all going to be forced to worship at these false altars. And those that refuse to bend the knee when the bell rings, we get to go to the fiery furnace. And that's where we're going. It is what it is. So, but I'm like you, Skip. Nope. Speak truth to evil. Do not bow. Do not kowtow to it, because once you give in and apologize or try to go along to get along, they're going to eat you and destroy you anyway. You're not going to be saved. So it's better to stand up for the truth now. At least you're standing on God's side.
Yeah. Back to what Mark was saying a while ago. Mark, I don't know if you can see this, see my screen, but America's Christian majority is shrinking and could dip below 50% by 2070. And then the part that's in kind of outlined in purple, I didn't do it, but U.S. Christian majority has been shrinking for decades. A Pew Research Center study shows that as of 2020, about 64% of Americans identify as Christian. 50 years ago, that number was 90%. So
I disagree with the number. I
You
don't
think
think it's going to take. I don't think it's going to take the
it's gonna take
2070
that
to be.
long? Yeah, well,
No, no. At the numbers of aliens that are being poured into the country from China and from the Middle East and from other areas of the world, third world, that they're not Christian at all. I don't, I think that number is going to drastically. It might be next year that we might be a minority in this country. And that doesn't even take into consideration the negative birth rate that those of us that are indigenous to this country are having. Our birth rate replacement rate is like 1.6 something. A civilization cannot survive another generation with those numbers. So they're importing, third world mind, and their birth rates are like in the 4s and 5s. So they'll outbreed us within, less than a generation. So I don't think it'll take to 2070 before Christianity becomes a horrible minority in this country.
yeah,
Just my opinion. Just my opinion.
it may not. Okay, back to because we can go on with this all day long. Any other comments? Next week, Mark is going to give a message, and Michael's going to run Good Luck, the go to meeting. Oh, I need to stop the recording. Hey, you might need to